So good evening to everyone. My name is Jakub Hurta and I'm from the webinar team and I'm from the Czech Republic, and I'm very glad that I can be here with you tonight. And I would like to welcome our guest speaker for tonight, and it is Tasha Chapman. And the topic for tonight is negotiating ministry, working with people in light of power and different interest differences. And before we start, I would like to introduce Tasha very quickly. I have a short bio, and Tasha Chapman teaches courses on educational ministry, learning theory, curriculum design, leadership theory, and research at Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. Tasha earned a PhD in educational studies at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Illinois, and she has worked in diverse ministries in several countries with focuses on university and international students, as well as women, children, and those with special needs in the church. She's a co-author of the book Resound Ministry. Tasha and her husband David, who teaches New Testament at the seminary, have 2 young adult daughters. So thank you, Tasha, very much for being with us for tonight, and we are looking forward to hearing your presentation. So I would ask you to start your presentation in a minute. And last technical information for all of you: if you have any technical problems, you can send a message to me through the chat box here. You should see it on the right side of your screen, or you can send me an email, and I hope that we will be able to solve it. So I think that's all for now, and now I would like to ask Tasha to start her presentation.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you joining me live or looking at this later. The first thing I want you to know is that the slides will all be available to you. They'll be posted within a day or so. So I want you not to work on taking notes in English or trying to translate to notes. I know that is very hard while someone's speaking in a second language to you. So all the slides are yours, but let's read through them together and reason together, and then we'll do question and answer time at the end. So first, you notice the title, Negotiating Ministry. We're going to talk about some ministry leadership issues that we often don't think or talk about that can really help us in ministry. And it's going to sound political in that we're going to use some business words and political words like power and interests in a particular way, but we're not talking about government at all. We're just talking about ministry and leadership in ministry. First, we're going to start with 3 leadership challenges that often are very hidden to us and that we're not thinking about. Then we're going to look at a myth, a real story that our cultures feed us all the time about leadership that is detrimental to our leadership. It's making it harder to lead well, that these challenges come from. Then we're going to go to 4 English words that you'll want to translate later. We're going to redeem them from the research of the business world and see how they can help us in ministry leadership that's more grace-based and kingdom-oriented for God's glory. So here we go, the 3 hidden leadership challenges that make ministry messy. And obviously we could use lots of other words beside messy, but I wanted a more lighthearted word for this so that we can approach the hardest things in our ministries with a sense of trust, perhaps even humor through God's grace. So our first hidden challenge is that we have expectations that everyone in ministry will behave graciously and get along. I mean, really, we walk into church or into that ministry meeting, and because everyone's a saint and Jesus is in their lives, we just expect everything to go smoothly. And of course, that's not what happens. Everyone brings hidden expectations into the meeting, into any ministry event. And so here's some general words about expectations. One is that unspoken and unclear expectations are toxic. That is, they're poisonous to our relationships because they're hidden, and yet we act out of them. And so they easily create communication chaos. So often we don't even realize we're bringing expectations to the conversation or to the ministry event. It helps to become aware of our expectations, and then we can clearly evaluate them and also discuss them with others, get them out of that unspoken zone where they can cause problems. But this particular expectation that things should and will happen smoothly, it looks like this. Pull this humor piece off the web. We expect things to go well and smoothly because after all, we're mostly working with God's people. So we expect the straight line, but what we really get is a knotted mess so often. We expect that smooth process to get things done in ministry work, but more often we get a mess. And that expectation itself causes us to become anxious, to become more fearful, because we just weren't prepared to have to untie a knot in ministry. What really can help us is when we wake up in the morning and we face that ministry challenge, to remind ourselves what are our expectations, and then remind ourselves where we are in God's story, to have that healthy, realistic hope and faith about our work. We remember that we are a good part of creation. Creation was good, and that we are image bearers of God, and so all humans deserve respect, that God gave us good work to do even before Adam and Eve rebelled. Work and stewardship over his creation was good for us to do, and we continue to have good work to do. Although we rebelled, humanity rebelled against God, and so now we live in a broken world where we have to deal with our sin, the sin of other people, Satan's attacks, and the fact that just the rest of creation is fallen and broken. So our work has thorns in it, we say. And so we don't need to be surprised that we hit knots, that we hit communication chaos and conflict in our ministry work. But we remember that we are in a time of redemption, that Jesus has paid for all the sins through his life, death, and resurrection, that he has granted us his spirit to give us wisdom and power to untie these knots, to help in God's work of redeeming all things under the lordship of Christ. And so we do this with a sure hope of a final restoration, that God will, with the return of Jesus and the renewed heavens and earth, he will make everything back the way it was created to be before our rebellion. And so that can really help us before we go into a planning meeting, before we go into an event for our ministry, or start to meet with someone for our work, to go back to where are we in God's story, so we think realistically, but also hopefully about our work. The second hidden leadership challenge that I want to name is our surprise that trying to get things done involves relational, emotional complications. And why do we think that we can just get things done quickly and that things will fall into place? Well, part of it is that we're not remembering how much time relational and emotional work takes. Ministry work, as you can see my equation there, leads to change. All ministry work we can think of as change work because it's part of the redemption of all things. It's part of pushing back against the brokenness of our world. It's about sanctification in ourselves as well as in other people towards maturity in Christ. So ministry work is about change, but human beings actually don't like change right now in our fallen state. Change, even good change, causes us to fear, perhaps to be anxious, and we experience loss. So to give a silly example, say you're on a leadership team for a church and you decide that God has provided enough resources to change out the chairs in the sanctuary. You've had plastic stackable chairs with no padding, and you're ready, and the group decides we're going to buy new chairs and they're going to have really good padding, and this will be a blessing, especially to our elderly. It's hard to sit on hard plastic chairs for the whole worship service. So you're thinking change is very good. And so the next Sunday, all the chairs are new. And after church, after worship, you hear people complaining and fussing and in conflict about the new chairs. And you think, but this is a good change. Why is there all this anxiety and complaining and people being angry even about the new chairs? Well, one is that that change brought fear. Maybe some people are fearing that the resources weren't used the way they would have used them. Maybe they're anxious about these new chairs causing the group to become in debt, or about keeping the chairs nice and new. Maybe there's something about the old chairs, even if they hated them and complained about them being so hard, that they actually miss. And so now they're going to talk as if they would rather be in the old chairs. As silly as that may sound, change does result in these responses from all of us. Emotions are a part of bearing God's image, not just part of the fall. Sometimes I think emotions are just part of the fall and our sinfulness, but they're not. We need to learn from our emotions. That next point, our brain's emotional area is 2 times faster in responding to input than our rational, logical area. So that means the emotions happen. They're there. It's whether we recognize the emotions and the emotions of other people, and then if we'll take the time to learn from them before we act because of them, right? So that's the issue with emotions. So we should say all of our ministry work is going to be emotional work, and be prepared to deal with people's emotions, and be prepared to deal with the fact that that's going to, emotional reactions can break relationships very quickly. I like this quote from author Bill Jensen. Why aren't leaders better leaders? Because they pretend that the challenges of leadership are rational and tactical, or things that are just about physical objects, or just about strategy or vision, rather than the truth, which is that leadership is about emotional and conversational work. So that's our second hidden leadership challenge. Here's our third, our quick decision making. This really causes us lots of problems. It's quick decision making that does not account for the perspectives of those who will experience the impact of the decision. So I'm not saying that everyone in the church needed to have a vote in whether the chairs got replaced or not in the sanctuary, right? Going back to our example story. But did the group account for, did they think about all the different perspectives that different groups of people in the church would have about this decision? Did they go and talk to people about it before the decision was finalized? Again, because decisions bring about change, and change leads to fear, anxiety, and loss in our people. And so if we can slow down our decision making a little bit more in order to deal with the relational, emotional issues of change, it will serve us well. A couple points here, that this is very hard to do, to slow down decision making, because cultural pressure is for fast efficiency. Cultural pressure in all our cultures is for results and performance. And cultural pressure is to be a hero leader. In the many countries I've traveled to and worked and learned and taught in, this has been true for every country. This ideal of that leadership is about being a hero, and that's my metaphor name for it. So let's look at what that is, because I think this basic cultural issue in the air, if you will, that we breathe, is what leads us to these hidden challenges. And so we want to name it before we go on to some practical helps. Here's a quote by some very famous Harvard Business School researchers and writers. They say, many tend to hold to the self-image or ego ideal of being leaders. That is, people really like to think of themselves as a leader. They appear to want to be leaders, not so much for what it may mean for them to practice leadership, that is the actual actions of what leadership is, but because the word leader acts like a normative magnet within many cultures, much like the word hero. People try to fulfill whatever specific notion of leadership they have absorbed from their cultures. So it suits us to think about, what does my culture tell me is a leader? And then to draw that out and put it against how Scripture talks to us about being loving, servant, sacrificial leaders within a body of Christ, where all need to be working their gifts and participating in the good work God has given us. So to look at culture and what is culture saying, so we can push against it and it's not a hidden pressure on us. So this is clearly from our research in the United States, but everywhere I've gone, you all tell me it's the same in your country. The culture assumes and really pressures us to be a hero leader, a leader that is these things, is highly rational and values efficiency most. And we've talked about how that's a hidden challenge to leadership. It really trips us up. That a leader does not value emotional and relational work. And yet to lead change is to need to do mostly emotional, relational work with people. That a leader makes quick decisions for others. That a leader fixes the problem or tells others how to fix it, etc. So you see how these things lead to those hidden assumptions about what leadership is, and then we get caught right up in hero leader type of actions that actually are not helpful to our situation and cause the mess, as I say. So here's what we think leadership looks like, or what our culture tells us leadership looks like. It looks like command and control. It looks like having the power and the resources, and neighbor ownership, or like the rooster, it means just follow me, do what I do. But what if leadership is actually more about, so here's some very different words to help us push against culture, an art. So leadership is something we all learn and grow in. It takes trying new things. There's not one right way. Like art, it's something where we have to try and fail and learn. And sometimes and often it takes spur of the moment decisions and wisdom. And what it's about is not follow me, but it's more about gathering people together. And what are we gathering people together to do? We're gathering them to pursue their biggest challenges, not to follow us, not to watch us fix problems, but to help them pursue their biggest problems in order to serve the world redemptively, all to the glory of God. And then to make this more fully biblical, from a framework of humility and conviction. Humility from the gospel grace of God, conviction from kingdom values of the now and coming King. So a very different description of leadership, to gather people to face their biggest challenges, more like these pictures. The way the birds gather, instead of lining up behind, they gather to keep the baby birds warm. The way they team functions together to get in the missing puzzle piece or to clean the yard. Leading well involves time for the emotional, conversational work of gathering people to grow through facing and working on their biggest problems and challenges. So if we're thinking this way, then we can attend the meeting, perhaps about changing the chairs in the sanctuary, and say, okay, my role in leading this meeting is to gather people to face the challenges of changing the chairs in the sanctuary, and to find out what the expectations are, to find out what the emotions are going to be, and to predict those and be ready, and to find out where all the conversations are that we need to have. Not just take a quick vote and go change the chairs immediately. You see, it's a slowing down. So what we have in the chart is just a discussion, if you will, of the two ways that then we approach leadership. If we're approaching it as the hero, we cause things to be anxious and fearful in our people. And you can see what comes under that, as opposed to if we choose to approach the situation as an emotional, conversational work, where our role is to be calm and gather people and help them face challenges well, then it's going to be grace-based. We're going to expect God to work and realize not everything's on us for success. We're going to focus on the process of what we're doing as leaders, not on just having efficient answers. We're going to focus on empowering people, on helping them have the capacity to act and to work on their problems. We're going to ask good questions. It's going to require courage and flexibility, things like that, questions and attitude of how can I help as leader, and what can we learn together because we're facing challenges together. So a very different way of looking at leadership. Okay, now to the practical. Here are four usually considered very political or very business-oriented words that I think can really help us. Well, from our research at Covenant Seminary, we've learned that these words and thinking about them in a particular way can really help us see and clean up the messiness of leading ministry. And so I'm very thankful that in God's common grace, we can look at business research on leadership and learn many things that help us lead even in ministry in the church. So we have these four words to help us see better. In other words, they give us a different perspective, and they help us be ready for the emotions and the conversational and relational needs of our people as we lead. Power, interests, stakeholders, negotiation. What are these four words in your first languages? Here's where you will have to really work on translation, because these words are very tricky. In English, they can carry a lot of negative connotations, a lot of negative thoughts. We need to give them a very plain, even description. So let's do that and then talk about each. Power. So we're going to make a tool out of these words to help us in our leadership. Power, the capacity to act or influence. It's largely based on the relationships in the context. So it's a capacity. So everyone has power, but we have different amounts of capacity to act or influence. You can see it's a very level, neutral way to think of power. Andy Crouch, in his excellent book, Playing God, says power is meant for image bearing, and image bearing is meant for flourishing. So that immediate moral ethical issue of how are we using our power as image bearers of God in order to further people towards the way things are going to be in the new heaven and new earth. Are we leading them towards flourishing in the redemptive work we're doing with our power? Now, just to name authority, many people confuse in English the words power and authority. So I like to just say authority is a type of power. It's a type of formal organizational power that's given, delegated or given to another. But usually I find if I just use the word power, I can help myself and help others think about what we're doing with our leadership. So there's two types of power. And this is key when we think about power and what the differences are in power of people trying to get something done. Formal power, the capacity to act and to influence due to a position, which usually comes with responsibilities, a job description, and a title, all set by an organization. So like our picture, the title boss. So this man with the cigar has formal power being boss. He can act and influence what happens because he was hired to be boss by an organization. Formal power is created and made legitimate by other people, by the social system where the power is exercised. So there's formal power. So if you have a title in your ministry work, that gives you a certain capacity, ability to act and influence what happens. But there's also relational power, the capacity to act and to influence based on human relationships in community, apart from formal roles and titles. Relational power is built over time in the forms of credibility, trust, respect, shared morality and values, and or known physical ability. So relational power is a power that we can see people have. They have this ability to act and influence what happens in the meeting, for example. Maybe we're at the meeting to discuss chairs in the sanctuary, and we watch people speak up and share their opinions, and they're using different amounts. They have different amounts of power or weight to what they say, because maybe they have titles like pastor or director of facilities or director of worship. But then they also have relational power. Maybe some of them are very, very good friends with each other, so they have already talked about the issue and they're in agreement. And so they bring ability to influence what happens in the meeting because they have these relationships. So they have relational power that adds to their ability to get things done in the meeting. Now, here's the catch for us. Relational power, at the bottom here, relational power is usually stronger than organizational power. In other words, even if people have no title or no formal position to make decisions about the chairs in the sanctuary, if they have more trusting relationships with people in the church, their opinion will be stronger, and their ability to create change or conflict in the church will be much stronger than those with titles like the pastor or the director of worship. So it's important to think about how much power, how much capacity to act do people have. And it depends on those two things, both the formal and the relational. Just to remind us about power, just a word from Jesus here when he called the disciples to him and said, correcting them very harshly actually after what happened before this, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came, not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So just reminding us that our call to use our power and our call to leadership to help others use their power, use their capacities that God has given them and their gifts, to use this to serve first and foremost. A couple more thoughts on power. God chooses leaders who aren't deceived by the myths of power and control, but who realize that God's power is found in brokenness. So again, Dan Allender helpfully reminding us to push against our cultures that say, hero leader, have command and control, that's the way to lead. And we say, no, God's power is actually found in brokenness. So we remind ourselves that we are broken vessels, and that Christ's glory and grace shines out through our cracks. From Ron Heifetz, again, a Harvard Business School researcher, effective leadership is not about personal power, but about helping people use their power and gain even more to make progress on difficult issues. So again, the idea of leadership isn't about me using my power to make my way happen, so we get the chairs I want in the sanctuary. Leadership is about helping other people use their power on this difficult issue to help us make this change in the most healthy and fruitful way we can for the sake of God's church. Our second key word that we need to add to our group of 4 tools that really can help us unknot the mess of ministry is this word stakeholders. And so that's my humorous picture of a key stakeholder, making fun of the word stakeholder, spelled 2 different ways in English. But it can help us remember who are the stakeholders. These are the persons with interests and investments in the initiative, the planning, and the decisions, with potential to gain or to lose something from it. So it's important to slow down in our hurry to make decisions as leaders and say, wait a minute, who are the stakeholders? Who are the people that are going to have to live with the decision that we're making about the chairs, and who have something to gain or to lose from the fact that we want to change the chairs? Who has a stake, that is, who has a vested interest in what we're doing? And let's make sure that we're thinking about them and that we're talking to them and accounting for what they are fearing to gain or to lose in change. One more thing about stakeholders. Each stakeholder has unique interests that they bring to the plans and activities we're leading. So each person comes with, in a sense, their own issues that they're fearful about losing. And you can see the different colors. But people are often unaware of what their interests are and how tightly they're holding on to them. They may not have been aware of how much they valued and cared about the old plastic seats in the sanctuary, because they were easy to clean when children spilled on them or something. And so it's very important to realize people bring their interests, but most of us don't realize how many interests we hold as a stakeholder in the event. So interest is our third key tool word. Interests are goals, values, expectations, or predispositions. Sorry, some big English words there. That lead a person to act in one way or another. So our interests reflect the way we think the world should function. Most of our interests are hidden from us and from others. So again, it's something way back here in our minds and our emotions. And because we're unaware of them, we can't work with them directly. They just cause a mess of confusion in our communication and in our leadership and in our work. But if we get them out here where we can work on them, or at least some of them, out here where we can see them and we realize what the interests are and why we're upset about the chairs in the sanctuary, then we're really doing some good work. Most of our interests are hidden. We read that. People gather together around similar interests. So even if my interests are hidden in how much I valued or liked the old plastic chairs, I may not know that consciously, and yet I'm going to gather with other people who think like I do, and we're going to increase our power, increase our ability to get something done by gathering together around these similar interests. And then we're going to promote and defend our interests in the decision. And that's what we see when we change the chairs quickly, and then we watch all this chaos explode and a bunch of conflict and anger and anxiety and questions about changing the chairs. And we're like, why is this such a big deal? Because people are promoting their interests now, even after the fact. Now you're hearing all the reasons that they didn't want the chairs changed, etc. So interests, who are the stakeholders and what are their interests? And then finally, because when people come together to do work, they have different amounts of power, different interests, and so there's going to be what we call negotiation in order to come together and actually get work done. So negotiation is to confer, to bargain, to discuss with a view towards reaching agreement with others. In negotiation, people bring their own interests to the meeting. They use their power to promote their interests, and that action impacts the ongoing relationships as a result. And so at those discussions, people are breaking trust or gaining trust with each other. They're loving each other well, or they're injuring each other, maybe even without knowing it. So there's our main words. Let's take a couple minutes to practice with our 4 tools. Here's what we may think of as a simple picture. Here's a Sunday school class, and we see the teacher in the foreground, blurred on the right-hand side, and then we see several children sitting on their pillows on the floor. And I say, here is a ministry situation. So let's use our words here. Where do we see power is the first word. Well, let's think. We have formal and relational power. Where do we see formal power? Well, the teacher is known as the teacher for the Sunday school class. So she has formal power to act and to influence what happens in the classroom because she's the teacher. And that gives her an ability to do this work of ministry with these children. The children do not have formal power. They don't have a title or a formal role that the church has given to them for this event. But there is one more person here that has formal power that's hidden. Guess who? The photographer. The photographer is there officially because the church said we want pictures of our children in their Sunday school classes. And so they have a role and responsibility to be there that is formal. And that gives them the right to stand behind the teacher and, you know, shine the camera at the children. Now, what's interesting is who has more power in this picture? The teacher, the photographer, or the children? Well, I would say it depends on the relationships. But if the children have been together for a while and they know each other well and they have trust with each other, that they have more power than the teacher and the photographer combined. Because of their relationships and because there are more of them. So for example, if we say, who are the stakeholders in the teacher being able to teach her lesson this morning? Well, the teacher is a stakeholder. She has interest in doing a good job helping the children learn. That's her interest. The children are stakeholders. Whatever happens in that Sunday school classroom with them that morning, they have interests. They want to have fun. They want to learn. They need and feel a desire to belong to the church and to be loved. And of course, the photographer is a stakeholder because a photographer needs to get good pictures to do their job well. And so they have interest that the children would sit properly, would smile at the teacher, would look engaged in the lesson, etc. But notice the one little boy who's looking not at the teacher, but at the photographer. What if he was quite the leader of the group? What if he decided now is the time for all the kids to get up and dance for the photographer instead of listen to the story? So he could have much more power, and he could use his power and his unique interests to gather all the other children towards his interests away from, contrary to the interests of the teacher, and could cause chaos with her Sunday school lesson. So she is actually in a position of negotiation as she goes through teaching the Sunday school lesson. For example, she might need to say, hey, let's all sit quietly and smile so the photographer can take a good picture of us for mom and dad or something. And she's negotiating the interests in order to get the work done. Seems simple, but needed something simple to use our 4 key words. Due to time, I'm going to skip and just leave for you the reflection on scripture here when we think about what are the interests of Christ. So there's one of our key words we can even use in thinking about God's interests in the situation, and God is, in a sense, the stakeholder of all stakeholders, and why Paul would choose here to appeal rather than command. And so here in this a verse in Philemon, in fact, the whole letter, we see Paul serving well in truth and grace and not commanding and controlling the situation the way he could with his formal leadership power, but he's using his relational power and just appealing to people to do the right thing. Okay, so now we need some really practical ways that our 4 key tools can really help us move redemptively in the leadership work of untangling knots in ministry, as I call it. So here's some powerful questions I want to leave with you that we can think about, hopefully before the meetings and the conversations to change the sanctuary chairs or to get work done, as I say. So let's read through these. Think about a recent conflict you had in ministry. So this would take some time, and it's most helpful to us in learning if we come up with something very concrete that recently happened to us. So we're listing details of what actually happened. Here's our reflection questions for this. What were your interests in this conflict? What were you afraid of losing in the change, right? Because we're going to assume that ministry work is about change. So there's always loss in change. What were our interests? What were we afraid of losing? Can we name those and get them out of this hidden area and out here where we can work on them and ask God to help us gain wisdom about them? How did you represent your interests? Because if you're a stakeholder, because there's conflict, we know we were stakeholders, we had something to gain or lose. So we came with interests. How did we represent our interests? Why were these interests important to you, to us? How did your interests compare to the interests of Christ? So we actually hold those interests up in that conflict and say, Lord, how do these compare to your values and what you're interested in seeing happen in the redemptive work of your world? And then what do you think were the interests of the others involved before the conflict started? So again, what do we think they were afraid of losing or gain or wanted to gain before the conflict broke out? So some very key questions working on just this area of being stakeholders and having interests or values that are often very hidden. And now even more practical approach for using our 4 tools that we use at the seminary and we do with case studies with students in our leadership seminars in class. So for an upcoming planning time, we'll actually build a chart so we can actually get our ideas out on paper, we can see them more clearly, think about them more clearly apart from those emotions, right, that are kicking off faster than our rational thoughts. And so we ask, who are the stakeholders in whatever this planning session is going to talk about? What are their main interests, or at least what do we think are their main interests? And of course, and then that'll send us out to go talk to them to find out what their interests are in the issues. And then what power differences do they have? And power, again, it's often a perception of ours that I do or don't have power to influence what's going on. And so what power do we think these people have? Do we think they feel like they're heard? Like they can influence the decision? Do they think they're in control of the decision? Or do they think, oh, woe is me, I can't do anything about this decision? Do they feel powerless, which is not a grace-based gospel place we want our people to be when we're leading ministry? So there's our tools in a chart. And then with those things charted out, we can ask which stakeholders will be involved in the planning negotiations. We can't have everybody at the table deciding which chairs to buy for the sanctuary, but we can represent most of the types of interests that people have when we come together for planning. And to ask ourselves realistically, who of the stakeholders is actually involved in planning and who is not there? Who did not come to the meeting? For example, if the Jones family were the ones that originally 40 years ago bought those chairs for the church, and then they were not talked to about this decision to change the chairs, you might very much in that good change actually alienate and drive away and hurt terribly that Jones family and all their friends, right? Because maybe they were stakeholders that were not involved in the decision. Question 5, how can I help people feel more equally empowered in the process? How can I help them feel like they can use their gifts, their ability to act and to influence in this good untangling the knot process? That's good servant leadership. How can I help all the key stakeholders feel heard, that their interests are valued and understood, even if they don't actually have a vote, technically, or even if they don't get to be at the meeting where the decision is made? How can I help them feel heard? That's an emotional, conversational work, again, of leadership that takes time. How can we negotiate with grace and truth in order to serve God's redemptive work? So there's our 4 key tools at work with some very key questions. 6 key questions, is it? Oh, well, first the interest questions, and then these, and a chart. So very practical, pragmatic work we can do at the end. And finally, just to let you know, these webinar ideas are expanded in a book of our findings from years of leadership research with both ministry and marketplace leaders that Bob Burns, Donald Guthrie, and myself were involved in this research for 8 years here in the United States. And so we're finally getting out this second book of what we learned in our findings, hopefully to the strengthening of the church. So that's out in January. Okay, that is all from me. We need to go now to some question and answer time and see if we've got some thoughts or concerns that need to be addressed before we close down.
Thank you so much, Tasha, for your presentation for now. And Tasha, maybe I have one question for the beginning. As English language is not the first language for me, as you mentioned, I maybe have a question about the word or the term stakeholder.
Yeah.
Could you please maybe say some maybe synonyms, or could you describe it more? Because I'm still thinking maybe about the word in my language that
Yeah.
would describe it. So can you maybe say some more synonyms, like, did I understand it like correct, that those are usually the people who care about the decision, who, for example, the decision is like will affect them, or can you maybe, yeah.
Right. So it's a way to, the reason I like to use this is a business term, usually not used in ministry, but I like to use it from the marketplace because it wakes us up. It helps us realize we need to see and look for the stakeholders. So that's why I like to use it, because we don't have a good biblical term for this that that is so sharp in its focus. So it's anyone who cares about what happens.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is, often we don't realize we care until something changes. So that's why it's very tricky to think, if I make a decision to change the chairs in the sanctuary, who is that going to affect? Who has to live with the results? That's another way to say stakeholders are the people that will have to live with the results of what I do.
Yeah.
So another word might be who will be impacted, or who might be impacted, who might care.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe one more thing connected to this, as you said, that the change, usually people, like, even if the people don't think that the change will like affect them, or like that they will change their mind, usually the change causes some discussion, and sometimes negative reactions. So maybe when I'm thinking about that, like in the context of my ministry, I use ministry with a team, and so I'm thinking, what might be some like practical steps maybe for helping like the people be really thinking that, for example, now for this term we do this like thing according to this plan, and then we have to change it. What are your experience in this field? Like, is it, for example, good to, I don't know, like set some like specific goals, like for that will be like measurable and for like a specific term, and then say like, so the people would know like this is like for like, I don't know, like for before the end of the year we'll like evaluate it and then we'll start over, or so. What are your experiences about this?
Yeah. So so you're asking generally about the planning process, I think. And I think one of the most helpful practical things we can do is slow down enough to do that chart and to tell people, hey, we're going to meet about the plan for this term and our goals. And so come prepared with what is most important to you, what you most want to see happen, right? So what you're doing is asking people, get it out of back here, get it on a piece of paper, come prepared to the meeting with what your interests are. And go talk to the different people, like go ask some people in your group, maybe some of your student leaders, go ask them so that you represent them at the meeting as well. So bring your list of things for the term that you're concerned about or you want to see change, and your goals, and then bring the short lists of some of your students that you just informally talked to, ask them what they were thinking about the term. That way, when you have the meeting, people are actually prepared emotionally to have the conversation about who will be impacted and what their interests are, what they want to gain or learn or lose, what they're fearful about or expecting. I hope that sounds simple, but it's very, it profoundly changes our meetings if we come prepared with a list of our interests and the other stakeholders and their interests at the same time, so that we're just accounting for more wholly how the change will impact people, how the plan will impact people. And so even if I don't get my way at the meeting, which I won't always get my way, right? At least my interests were in the conversation. And so I can feel heard and feel valued, even if the decision goes a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a good question.
And then we have their next question in the chat box. Do you see it, or should I read it out loud?
Yeah, can you read it out loud?
Yes, of course. There's a question from Colin. So, would I be right in understanding that you have set out a leadership style that is more concerned about relationships than quick results?
Yes. And of course, we hold these things in the tension of needing wisdom in the moment. But generally, if we could think of leadership as that conversational, relational work of gathering people together to work on their biggest challenges, rather than getting results. It's not that, I mean, obviously we need goals, but our goals in ministry are much more than what can be counted. And so our cultures push so hard on goals and performance and things that can be numbered, like money or noses, you know, how many people attended. So we have an expression, you know, ministry is about much more than noses, nickels, you know, our small coin, and noise. And so just because we have lots of people and they're making lots of noise at a youth ministry event does not mean they're actually growing towards maturity in Christ, right? And so to push back against that culture of we have to have numbers and we have to have just get to the numbers as fast as we can, I think it is a very healthy thing for us to do, to just slow down a little bit more. Now, in a crisis, do we need speed? Yes. In a crisis, we need speed from our leaders, that's for sure. So again, we hold these generalizations with a need for wisdom. But ask some more, Colin, if I can say more about that. So it's not about an absence of goals or assessment, because I think assessment and evaluation is very important. That's how we learn and grow, is to say, oh, how close did we reach our goals, our target? So it's not about not having those, it's about focusing on the process as we move towards them and how we think about leadership in that process.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Are there any more comments or some more questions? Okay, there's a question. Okay, so crisis would be represented by the need to act quickly when the famine is predicted in acts, as one example. Do you see the question, or should I read it again?
Yeah, I don't understand it.
Okay, so, or do you see it in the chat box?
No.
Okay. So crisis would be represented by the need to act quickly when the famine is predicted in acts, as one example.
Oh, yes. So I think the reason I brought up the idea of crisis usually demands speed and to act quickly from leadership. If there's a crisis and a need immediately, we don't have time to talk to all the stakeholders, to use that word. We don't have time to talk to all the people that our decision will impact first. We may not have time to prepare well our lists of what our interests are and what we're fearful of, etc. We may just really need to act and gather people very quickly and learn as we go. So I use that just to say that mostly this view of leadership is telling us to slow down, to account for things that are slower and require more conversations and more people work before acting. But I would never want to say that in all situations we have time or is wise to actually do this work of accounting and thinking about all the stakeholders. So again, just want to always give room that these are tools, but only God can help us use them wisely. because our situations, the knots we face in ministry are all very different. So no easy answers, but at least some new ways to think and to see things in our ministries that we can try. So I'll leave you all with a final thought, and that would be, I just hope that at your next planning meeting, you might try this. You might try creating a chart. If you can think of 4 good words to use to replace the English ones, and see what happens, see where the discussion goes, and let me know. You can write to me at covenantseminary.edu, as I'm always continuing to learn and grow in issues of leadership myself. Thank you.